Hey y'all, this is Derek with Copperman Stills, and I'm getting ready to show you how to do a whiskey mash using flaked corn, barley, and midnight
It's easier
wheat.
to work with. You don't have to cook it. It's got all the starch pressed to the outside, so all you have to do is add good hot water. Our water's sitting at about 180 degrees right now, and we're gonna mix it in and start letting these soak. We're gonna probably let them soak for 30 minutes, maybe 45, while we make our grain mash in a separate container.
Okay.
Try to avoid clumping. We don't want to make a bunch of big biscuits in here. So we're about 180 degrees right now. We're going to stir it about every 10 minutes. But right now we're going to stir it until we get everything incorporated. When we're making whiskey, we want to go with 2 to 3 pounds of corn per gallon of water for our mash.
So we're looking at how many gallons of water here?
So I believe we're doing 60 pounds for a 30-gallon batch.
Okay.
Starting to get a little thick. That's the starch. It's going to get thick like grits. And then we're going to use our all-grain beer. We're using...
For most basic whiskey recipes, I like to use at least 2 to 2.5 pounds of corn per gallon of water for mash.
And whenever we add that...
I'll also be adding about 1.5 to 2 pounds of wheat, barley, or rye to this recipe per gallon of water per mash.
Gallon vessel. So we're probably putting in about 15 gallons with all of our grain. A pound of, 9.3 pounds of grain is like adding 1 gallon of water.
All grains have amylase enzyme in the rising of the grain. So when you break open the husk and then break open the meat of the grain, you're exposing the amylase enzyme. Amylase enzyme converts starches from corn or potatoes into sugars, which are fermentable by the yeast. The yeast will convert them into alcohol.
Mashing this, we're going to turn to making our malt beer, and we're going to do that in a separate container.
Okay.
We're going to try to leave out as much of the husk and the malts from the fermentation as we can. We're going to leave the corn on the fermentation and leave out the malts.
You can also buy liquid amylase and skip the grain process. They sell liquid amylase in most brew stores, or you can actually buy it on Amazon. And they have high temperature and a lower temperature amylase that can be added at different steps in the brew process.
Converting power. And what that means is it can, at a high rate, convert starches into sugars. So we're going to add this for our separate mash container, and we're going to start at 160 degrees. We have a target temperature of 154 degrees, and that's the optimal range for getting a good diacetic converting beer. And then when we're done with mashing this beer, we'll sparge it and step mash it up to get the rest of the sugars out of it. So we'll probably step mash it up to about 170 degrees over the course of 3 different sparges. That way we rinse all the sugars off the grain and get everything into our fermenter. And on top of that, we are cooking the grain further at a higher temperature, getting the rest of the sugars out of the grain. So sparges are just rinsing the grain.
Okay.
We'll probably let it steep for like 5 minutes on the grain at that new temperature.
Okay.
But for the purpose, we're just trying to rinse the sugars that are caught in the grain bed out into our fermenting vessel here.
Okay.
Here we are adding the grains. I go little by little. Again, we don't want to clump it up. This is a midnight wheat. It's a form of. We're adding barley. This is a 6-row barley. It also has a high diastatic converting power. We're making whiskey. With the profile that we have for the grain. I'd say we would want to do about 3 pounds. We want to do about 3 pounds.
As we finish adding this corn and water together,
per gallon of water,
and we're going to start making our all grain beer
and,
mash.
we'll
This will contain our naturally occurring amylase enzyme. It's going to take us about 45 minutes to let this mash steep, and then once it's steeped at about 154 degrees for 45 minutes, we're going to add the grain beer to the corn beer,
it becomes too
which will
thick of an
convert
environment for
all
them
of the
to
starches into
really
sugars.
survive. The yeast fall out of attenuation early, leaving behind a bunch of unfermented sugars that will caramelize whenever you go through your distillation process. And that's where you get those deep, dark, caramely flavors in bourbon. With bourbon, as far as the rye, the wheat, the barley is concerned, it's up to you, the ratio. Or if you only use one malt. That's all up to the maker. But as far as it goes, it needs to have that higher percentage corn to the mash. I think bourbon requires 51% corn in the mash.
Right. Together.
We're gonna steep the barley. We're gonna steep the malted wheat and the barley for another 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then we're gonna drain it off into our fermenter to convert the starches of the corn into sugar. And then we're going to sparge, we're going to wash the grains in here in order to get all of our sugars, but we're going to do that at a higher temperature than
This could all be
temperature.
done in the same vessel,
That way, while we're
but
starching,
I
we're
like
also
to
releasing
keep
new sugars
the
that weren't
grain husks
cooked
out
out
of the
the
fermentation
meat of the
process,
grain,
while
during
leaving
the
the
first
corn
kind of
in the
lower temperature
fermentation
run.
process. I
We're
believe
starting
it
to add
promotes
our
a better
grain beer
flavor
after letting it
and
steep.
overall smoothness.
And you can see that the hard bed of grits that we had there is already turning into liquid. So we're converting the starch into sugar, and it's happening really rapidly. This is exactly what we're looking for. So we'll continue to do this until we add all of our grain beer, and then we'll sparge our grain beer. We're going to wash it with nice hot water, and then we're going to add that hot water that we washed our grains with to extract any left behind sugars that could be in that grain bed. This will just take, we'll probably sparge every 5 minutes or so. So this will probably be the next 15-20 minutes. So right now we have about 162 degree water. We're going to rinse the grains off with that. This process is called sparging. It's just washing the grains. There's going to be a lot of left behind sugars in that grain bed, and we're going to try to rinse them out and collect them so we don't leave anything behind. It's going to add to our efficiency. I'll just add a few gallons to rinse it, let it steep on this higher temperature for just a couple minutes, and then we'll drain it all off into the fermentation tank. All right, in this grain bed, there's a bunch of leftover fermentable sugars, and we're going to add nice hot water. The idea is these waters will travel down through the grain bed and make it out for our fermentation. That's all I got. Right now we're sparging again. This is the second round, but we're doing it at a higher temperature, 10 degrees higher. That way we're step mashing, and we're exposing and extracting sugars that may not have left the grain yet. Usually you could just sparge with the same temperature water all the way through. I like the step mash process because I believe you can extract a few more grain percentages or sugar percentages there. So we put our corn in at 180 degrees. We put in our grains at 160 degrees with a target temperature, drop temperature, down to about 154 degrees. Perfect temperature to extract the amylase enzyme. We added the beer to the corn after letting it steep for about 45 minutes. And the corn, all the starches have converted into sugars. It's very loose, very liquidy now. So we also did a step mash sparge. So we would wash the grains. We did that twice. Wash the grains with about 165 then 170 degree water. That way we are also extracting any left behind sugars and washing them from the grain bed just to get it into our fermentation. So here we are. We have our final product of our mash. We're going to let this cool to yeast pitching temperatures, and then we're going to pitch yeast on top of it. We've selected a Lutra Kvike. It has a temperature tolerance of 68 to 95 degrees, so we can pitch this yeast at 95 degrees. And right now we have a little bit of the grain beer Still a little warm, but we'll make a starter with the grain beer. We'll add the kveik to this, let it start getting activated, and then whenever this is at the perfect temperature, we'll toss it in here, mix it up, and let it ferment for maybe a week. It only really takes about 3 days, but if you have any starches that haven't converted yet, this kveik will take care of them. Just give them a little bit more time. About a week, come back, strain everything off of your grain bed, and you're distilling whiskey.
Nice.